This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so this is all about Legionnaires and the risk assessment. As I said before, that it's probably one of the most common questions I get in relation to landlords and letting agents. And I've had a few questions about it this week, funny enough, hence why I felt this particular course would be just good to run over. Obviously, we don't have a huge amount of time, so we're not going to cover every single eventuality or the detail, but just to give you a better overall understanding of where we're coming from in relation to Legionellas itself. And I will have a copy of a Legionella's risk assessment at the end of the course for you. And if you do want a copy, you're more than welcome to ask me for it and I will send it to you. And actually, it just really demonstrates the very simple nature that you need to follow in relation to compliance. So the first two slides are just to sort of, okay, why do we need to do this? And as some of you will have been on my courses before, you would have always heard me talk about Legionellas, or on some of the courses, I will talk very briefly about Legionellas. And as always, I always try and say, look, these are the things that do happen from time to time. 99% of the time, nothing will ever happen, and you'll never have a problem. That's fine. But you always use the words yet, and that's the issue. If something does happen as a landlord or a letting agent, what have you done to mitigate that risk? And I suppose, in a sense, that's where COVID has sort of played a part in relation to Legionella, because they're both the same in terms of breathing in droplets. And that's exactly the same as Legionella. You breathe it in, and it can create a problem for those with weakened immune systems. I mean, how many people are on this course today? About 20 odd. And I'm pretty sure one or two of us have probably had Legionellas previously, but we've not had it sufficiently bad enough that we've had to go to hospital, or we've had complications from it, or whatever it's going to be. I don't know if anyone's tested positive for COVID, but probably quite a few of us have had COVID and may not have known it. So that's a situation. It only becomes a problem if the person that's contracted Legionella has sufficient problems that the authorities get involved. And if they do get involved, then potentially they can look back at it and say, actually, where did this person contract Legionellas from? And they could potentially prosecute you as a landlord or a letting agent if you could not prove due diligence. I always remember when COVID first came out and they had the first couple of cases in the UK, it was almost like, it was the first big news story. I can't remember, was it Surrey? I think the first one they had, someone tested positive. And that's where it's coming from, really. It's about
it was actually Nottingham, Darryl. Nottingham had the first case.
Sorry, Didi, can you hear me now? So for some reason, I just need to disconnect my phone from my head.
Yeah, I can hear you now. Couldn't hear you before.
Yeah, I think sorry. My phone is my phone's connected to my headset. So I've just disconnected my phone from my headset. I think that's what happened. My phone call came through, and the headset disconnects when I've got a phone call coming through. So that's my own fault. So I've disconnected the phone from the headset. So just to make it nice and simple. Yeah, people saying they can hear me now. So yeah, it's just really about understanding where the potential risk comes from. So this one was quite big news. I think the garden centre, or in this particular instance, the gentleman died from contracting it from a hose, because the hose had been stagnant over the winter, and then obviously the water had stagnated in the hose itself, and it had grown into such an extent that it was spewing out basically contaminated droplets into the air, and he breathed it in, and he died from that contraction. The next one is about a garden centre, which some of you may have heard of, which sadly led to the death of the person that was delivering products and goods to the factory next door. So it was actually a garden centre. He actually didn't go into the garden centre, but because the hot tub was outside, spewing out the contaminated droplets, he was delivering to the factory next door, and he was delivering on a daily basis to the factory next door. and he contracted Legionellas from that, and he died from Legionella. And in that particular instance, the garden centre were fined over £200,000 by the health and safety executive for not having undertaken their due diligence in relation to Legionella. So that's obviously an extreme case from our perspective, but the health and safety legislation equally applies to you as a landlord or a letting agent. And letting agents are run as businesses, and landlords are running businesses, as you'll see later in terms of its definition. So you have an absolute obligation to undertake a Legionella's risk assessment. As you'll see as we go through, the ambiguity that lies, or that is very prevalent to landlords in particular, is to what degree do you have to do that Legionella's risk assessment? And in the majority of cases, I would say a very simple risk assessment is all that is needed from your perspective as a landlord or a letting agent for most of the properties that you manage. Obviously, if you've got a much more complicated system, then from your perspective, you may want to involve the services of a professional to do what you need to do. So just in terms of why you need to do it, again, it's all about due diligence. This will probably never, ever happen to you, which is probably how I teach most of my courses. Hopefully you'll never be taken to court. Hopefully no one will ever sue you. Hopefully no one will die on your property. But if they do, what have you done to mitigate that risk? And that's my job as a compliance officer, to try and mitigate or remove as best I can all the risks that you have as a landlord or letting agent. 99.99% of the time, nothing will go wrong. So you'll think, why did I employ Daryl? Well, you employ Daryl for the 0.01% of the time when it potentially could happen. And that's what it's about. So it's about protecting yourself and having that due diligence defense. Because when the judge says, well, what did you do as Mr. Landlord or Mrs. Letting Agent to protect the tenants? You can't say nothing. You can say, well, actually, I did a risk assessment, Your Honour, and here is a copy of my risk assessment. And that's what it's about. It's all about protecting yourselves as a business and as a landlord, because ultimately that is what the law requires of you. In terms of potentially what is Legionellas, so you actually find Legionellas in most water systems. Interestingly, you can drink water with Legionellas in it, and in most cases it won't be a problem. It's the multiplication of the bacteria which is the issue. So when it gets to such numbers that it starts becoming lethal. And also, it's about breathing it in. It's about breathing it into the lungs. So that's the issue. Hence why, as you'll probably see later, probably one of the most high-risk areas in terms of lettings is going to be in shower heads. So, you could have a property that's occupied, but the tenants never use the shower. So there could be water stagnating in the shower head. The house is occupied, so it's at a certain temperature, room temperature. So that water actually could be very, very high risk in terms of Legionella. So they're the things that you need to look at. And okay, what did I do as a landlord or a letting agent to minimize that risk to the occupiers if something did go seriously wrong? And that's what ultimately you've got to do. So you'll find the Legionella bacteria in most natural water systems. Obviously, from this course, it's really about, okay, what type of systems are most conducive to its highest risk? And I would probably say most of you probably own properties that have combination boilers. So there's no water tank in terms of hot water or cold water. The actual risk there is very minimal because the storage of water in the system is really low. So the chances of that water stagnating, getting unclean by bacteria or dirt or whatever it's going to be, is very, very low risk. So when you do a Legionella's risk assessment on a property that has a combination boiler and has no tanks, then your risk assessment needs to reflect the risk, which is very, very low. So a risk assessment of a couple of pages long would probably be sufficient enough to show your due diligence. So that's what it's about, really. It's about understanding the risk and acting accordingly. Now, as I said earlier, I think the highest risk for you guys as landlords and letting agents, for me, would probably going to be in the water tanks, any properties that actually have cold or hot water tanks, and also shower heads. They're probably going to be the highest risk areas in terms of rented property. And as I said to you earlier, it's about breathing the droplets into the lungs, which causes the issue. Now, in most cases, I would probably say that a normal person, without being disrespectful to anyone, a normal person would probably just get a bad dose of flu. So we could have had Legionellas, but no one's going to know that because we've not been tested for the Legionella bacteria. It's only if something serious happened that's when the health and safety executive or public health would get involved to see where the source of that contamination had happened. And that's what happened obviously in the garden centre, where the person died from Legionellas. They found that he had died from Legionellas, and then they tried to source it back to the original issue, which was obviously in that case the garden centre. Hence why they were fined £200,000, because I assume they could not prove that they had gone through a rigorous risk assessment in relation to that hot tub, or how they dealt with hot tubs. So that's a very extreme case, obviously, but from a landlord and letting agent perspective in particular, that's what we need to do for every single property that we manage. We need to have a risk assessment in place. In the very unlikely event something happens, what did I do as a landlord or letting agent in relation to that particular property? I don't know if anyone's ever had a problem with Legionellas in terms of any of their occupiers. I've never had in 25 years in lettings. So to give you an understanding of the risk, but the law very clearly requires us as landlords and letting agents to undertake it. So the legislation that covers it is the approved code of practice. You'll see that on the next slide. It's what they refer to as the L8. You can download the 80-page document if you want to for free, and you can read through it. A lot of it is not relevant to us as letting agents and landlords, but it gives you a very good overview of what the law requires of you. You also have separate obligations under the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, whether you are a letting agent or a landlord. And I'll go through those definitions very shortly. So the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, as some of you may be aware, is very generic. It's a very short piece of law, if that's the right way of saying it, but it actually gives you lots of obligations, because you'll see it in the definition. It sort of says you can't conduct your business in a way which creates risk for other people, which is very, very broad, I fully accept, but it does cover things like Legionellas, obviously. You also have what they refer to as COSH. It's the control of substances hazardous to human health. So again, when you've done your risk assessment, then you fall under COSH, because then you've got to say, okay, I've identified the risk. What am I going to do about that risk? So in my shower head example, I've identified shower heads are going to be an issue. So what am I going to do as an agent or landlord to minimize that risk? So what would you do? I mean, again, some of you might put it into the comments box. What are you doing as an agent or landlord? What are you doing to minimize the risk of shower heads? I'm sure most of you will probably say the same thing that I would say, but if you want to put it in the comment box, that's fine. So what are you doing to control the issues in terms of hazards to human health? And then the last one is what they refer to as riddle, basically, which is unlikely for you guys, but if there was an issue which happened, then you would have an obligation to report it. So if you did have a Legionella's issue in your property, then there is a potential obligation for you to notify public health and say, by the way, we've had an outbreak of Legionellas in this particular house, which is very, very unlikely that's going to happen. But legally, that's what you have to potentially do if you did have an outbreak of Legionellas in a rented property, which is highly unlikely in that sense. But if it did, it's more to do with big businesses, like shopping centres, those types of issues, if they had contamination in the air conditioning vents or whatever it was going to be. That's a picture of the L8, which is the approved code of practice. You can download that from the Health and Safety Executive website. I think it's 68 pages long. So if you're really bored this weekend, then there's 68 pages of fantastic information you can read there. I think they charge you if it's a book that you're buying, but you can download it for free. So the government do give stuff away for free. So you can download that for free if needs be. I don't know if anyone's read it. Sadly, I have. which shows you how sad I am. But if anyone wants to read it, they're more than welcome to do so. The other thing, again, which I pointed out to Lizelle, because I think Lizelle, you had an awkward landlord this week in relation to Legionellas. I always point it out. I mean, it's the guide which I'm sure none of you ever read, but it's the how to let guide. So you all probably are aware of the how to rent guide, which is the guide that you've got to give to the tenant when they first move into a property. This is the how to let guide, which is actually designed for landlords. So landlords understand their obligations when you're letting out a property. Obviously, as a very informed bunch of landlords, you probably, or letting agents, obviously, you probably don't need me to say what you need to do. But if I get my drawing pen up or my spotlight, you can see page 7 of the how to let guide. So this is what I would send to landlords if I was an agent. So I don't know if you got a response back from your landlord, Azelle. But this is what I would send them, and I would say, look, page 7 of the How to Let Guide, which is a government publication, it says at the very top, in the right-hand corner of page 7, you must ensure that the water supply is in working order and carry out a risk assessment to assess the risk from exposure to Legionellas. That is a risk assessment. You have to do one. The government say that. The health and safety executives say that. The law says that. There is no ambiguity. Absolutely 100% crystal clear. I must undertake a Legionella's risk assessment. Where the ambiguity lies is what form does that Legionella's risk assessment take? Now, in theory, when I drive my car down the road later, I will risk assess when I'm driving. Why? Because I need to make sure I get from A to B safely. But what I won't do is I won't write it down. I won't write down, I look left, I look right, I stopped at the traffic lights, whatever it's, I maintain my speed below the speed limit, etc. I didn't do that. So if someone says to me, well, actually, Daryl, can you prove to me that you drove down the road safely? Well, I would say, well, I got to the end of the road, so I assume I did. But I have no written evidence to prove that. So you'll see at the very bottom, it says on the checklist where my spotlight says, please make sure you keep records to ensure you have proof that you are following the necessary legal requirements. So how can you prove to me as a layperson that you've assessed the risk of Legionellas? That is the $64 million question, which in a sense I will try and answer today. But that is the $64 million question. And the only way of proving that is having a written risk assessment. So that's the important thing to remember. What there isn't is there is no gold-plated standard for what the risk assessment should be looking like, or how it should be created, or whatever it's going to be. But for the majority of the properties that you manage, I would argue very clearly that it just needs to be a very simple risk assessment, because the majority of the properties that you are going to own or manage are probably going to fall into the low risk category. There's no water tank in terms of a hot water or cold water tank. It's a combination boiler. I change the shower heads on a regular basis. There is no outside garden hose. There are no dead legs. I don't have a jacuzzi. Whatever it's going to be, that makes it nice and simple for you as the agent. Casey said, just going on to my message, Casey said, what was the page before the How to Let Guide, please? I didn't get to note it down fast enough. That's the LA Code of Practice, Katie. The LA, I think, stands for Legionella. That's the short code for it. But if you type in LA Code of Practice, it should pop up in relation to a downloadable link. So if you want to read the 68 pages while I'm talking, then you can give us a very quick summary at the end, if that's all right. Yeah, it's good to see Lizelle. You can see all the messages that are popping up. I'm not just making these up. They're in the message box on your control panel, hopefully. And Lizelle, yeah, maybe, hopefully he's not responding because you've given him all the information he needs to get back in his box. If that's hopefully not a disrespectful way of saying it to you. So, because I think he was being a bit awkward, wasn't he, about you having undertaken a risk assessment on his behalf. But legally, you have to. So that's the important thing as well. So this page here is quite good in relation to the law in terms of the How to Let Guide. The other thing we're going to talk about, so what does the Code of Practice, I need to be reasonably quick, so apologies, I might go a little bit quicker through these bits, but what does the law require? And we'll go through, what does it require? It basically requires you to do a risk assessment. And what you do need to consider, and we'll go through some of those issues that you need to consider. So as I said, shower heads, dead legs, cold and hot water tanks, how long has the property been empty for, who's going to be living at the property in terms of age, immune systems, those types of issues. So you assess the risk and then you control the risk, as we talked about earlier. COSH, control of substance hazards to human health. And then again, as I said, it's all about the legal requirements. So it puts it into a 68-page document for you about what you should and what you shouldn't be doing to try and achieve your aim. Just have a straw poll. I don't know how many we've got on this course, 20 odd. Actually, out of the 20 on here, how many of you are actually doing risk assessments at the moment, Legionella's risk assessments? You just put yes or no in the message box if you want, if that's easier. I don't think we have a poll thing, but it'd be interesting to see how many people actually do it. Out the ones here, I assume if you don't say anything that you don't do it. So for the ones that do it, just want to put yes into the message box. That would be great. That's again, in terms of the risk assessment, there are what they refer to the legislation. It talks about the duty holder is the agent or the landlord. So you're the person with that responsibility, and then the responsible person is the person who undertakes the risk assessment. So just to make you aware of that. So that's where we're going. So the duty holder would be you as the agent or the landlord. You're the person that ultimately would be the person that would be sued or prosecuted, if that's the right way of saying it. And then you have a level underneath is what they refer to as the responsible person, and that's the person undertaking the risk assessment itself. So for a letting agent, that could be an employee, that could be a landlord if he's doing it his or herself, or that potentially could be the company that are undertaking the Legionnella's risk assessment on your behalf. So that's when they refer, because you'll see in the L8, they will talk about a duty holder, which is the person that the law says is the person responsible in relation to the legislation. Then the responsible person is the person who undertakes the work themselves, or the risk assessment itself. So you're liable for the actions in terms of what's going to be undertaken after the risk assessment has been undertaken. And then we'll talk about subsequent reviews later, because again, the law is a little bit ambiguous about how often you should do them. Now, as you'll probably see later on my slide, I've put that you should probably do them between tenancies. So if the tenant changes every 12 months, you undertake a new risk assessment every 12 months. If you've got the same tenant in situ for 5 years, I would argue you only have to do it the once. First when they move in, and then don't do it again until another tenant's due to move in. So if you've got a long-term tenant, then you would only need to do it the once. But if you've got tenants changing every 12 months, my advice, my interpretation of the legislation is that you do it every time there's a change of tenant. This is about the person in relation to the person undertaking the risk assessment itself. Now, again, there's this ambiguity. Does someone need to be a professional to be undertaking a risk assessment? My argument, no. Anyone can potentially do it. I'm going to assume most of you are competent enough. I would probably expect someone that's just left school and has no idea about Legionellas and no idea about property, then probably they're not the best person to be doing it. But I would probably argue that any member of MPO should be able to do it, and I'm pretty sure all the agents I work with should be able to do it. So in that sense, that would probably be my definition of a competent person. So that's how I would interpret it. Someone who has a basic knowledge of property, and someone who's common sense enough to understand where the risks are going to be. But that's the L8 definition of a competent person. A competent person is someone with the necessary skills, knowledge, and experience to manage health and safety, including the control measures. And in most cases, the control measures are quite simple and basic in terms of its completion. Again, health and safety at work act, just going on the legislation, it should be the duty, this is talking about letting agents, it should be the duty of every employer to conduct his undertaking in such a way as to ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, that persons not in his employment who may be affected thereby are therefore thereby exposed to risk to their health and safety, are not therefore thereby exposed to risk to their health and safety. So that's the very generic clause, which obviously then includes Legionella, because Legionella is a risk. So as an agent, I have that obligation to reduce that risk by undertaking a risk assessment. So even though there's not an absolute piece of legislation that says you've got to get it done, all the health and safety legislation that comes together, there's a very clear overview that there's an obligation for an agent to undertake a Legionella's risk assessment. In terms of a landlord, and again, the Health and Safety at Work Act, you fall under it. I know you may not want to fall under the Health and Safety at Work Act, but you do, because again, your definition is this: it shall be the duty of every self-employed person to conduct his undertaking in such a way as to ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, that he and other persons not being his employees who may be affected thereby are not thereby exposed to risk to their health and safety. So they are the issues that you need to take into account when you're a landlord or a letting agent. And the other thing, when they talk about self-employment, it says landlords are basically deemed to be self-employed under the Health and Safety at Work Act. So landlords are deemed to be self-employed people, so therefore again they fall under that legal obligation. The thing that I always show to landlords, or landlords sometimes come to me and say, actually, Dale, we don't have to do it, the Health and Safety executive has said that, or actually they haven't. What they've said is that you don't have to pay someone to do it. You need to do a risk assessment, but you don't need to go to the extreme of getting the water tested for Legionella issues. So this is something I always show, because again, this is you can find this on the Health and Safety website. If you just type in HSE Mythbuster Legionellas, this will pop up. It says, and I've highlighted or I've bolded the first two words, there is a legal duty for landlords and letting agents, obviously, to assess and control the risk of exposure to Legionella bacteria, but health and safety law does not require landlords to produce or obtain, nor does HSE recognise a Legionella's testing certificate. So for those landlords who may have received a £300 bill because a Legionella's risk assessment company have been involved in doing your risk assessment, that's probably the gold-plated standard, but you don't need the gold-plated standard, because in most cases your risk is so low that you just need the bronze standard. The bronze standard is fine for your type of property. Obviously, I can't tell you what type of property you got, but again, I'm sure most of you will be common sense to realise whether I need a bronze, a silver, or a gold standard risk assessment. But I would say 99% of the properties that you manage would probably fall into the bronze level in relation to risk assessments, which just means a very simple risk assessment you can undertake as a landlord or letting agent. In terms of them buying a hot tub, Neil, it's their responsibility. Obviously, you would send them a leaflet to say, by the way, we understand you've got a hot tub, so it's your responsibility to maintain or manage it in relation to Legionella's risk. It's no different to a gas safety, really. If they bought their own gas safety portable heater or gas heater, it's their responsibility as a tenant to maintain it. It's not the landlord. It's only if the landlord provides it. So if you were kind enough to provide a hot tub, Neil, then it would be your responsibility to do the risk assessment. But if they buy it themselves, they can kill themselves. You just can't kill them in a very simplistic terms. Again, I see this sometimes. I see it actually on quite big letting agents' terms of business, which I find incredible in this day and age. They have a disclaimer. I see it on some of the biggest agents. So they have a little disclaimer saying, by the way, we're not liable if someone dies from Legionellas in your property. And I'm thinking, well, it's not your decision, Mr. Letting Agent. It's the HSE. Now, if they're fully managing, if an agent's fully managing a property and the landlord said, look, actually, I don't want you to do a risk assessment, the agent has a legal obligation to do it. They can't go, well, by the way, Mr. Landlord, can you sign me a disclaimer? Because it's not the landlord who's going to prosecute you, it's the HSE. Now, if you're an agent and you're managing a property, there's a very good chance that the HSE will actually go, you're the duty holder. I'm going to hold you liable because you're the ones that I legally believe have an obligation to do the risk assessment. So therefore, I don't care what your landlord says about a disclaimer. We're suing you. So having a disclaimer in the terms of business is about as pointless as a chocolate fire guard. So for me, that's the way I would look at it. So apologies for any agents who have a disclaimer in their terms of business, but it's pointless, absolutely pointless, because a landlord cannot defend you or help you if you're being prosecuted by the HSE. As a professional agent, you need to be getting these done. Thank you, Katie. Hopefully I'm making a lot of sense today, hopefully for a Friday afternoon. Okay, in writing, the requirements. In writing, simple and proportionate. Again, that's depending on the type of property that you've got. Testing of water not required, as we just mentioned. What are the control measures? So when you've done your risk assessment, what are you going to do? So in your case, Neil, if you put a hot tub into your property, or your landlord got a hot tub, what would your risk assessment say? Your risk assessment would probably say really high risk in terms of Legionella's infections, and then your control measure would say, actually get rid of it. That would be your control. So your risk assessment says, here's a hot tub, high risk, and your control measure is get rid of it. Exactly the same as a garden hose, because again, most of you will, I don't know how many of you check for garden hoses, but if you've got a garden hose, get rid of it as a landlord. Now, if the tenant goes and puts their own garden hose in and they die from their own garden hose, that's their responsibility, not yours. So that's what it's about. It's about providing as little as possible so that the tenant can harm themselves, which I know sounds a bit counterproductive in terms of the type of property that you're probably trying to rent out. But from a health and safety perspective, it's the best way. I think you'll see it later when we talk about temperatures, hot water temp. Now, I went on a course about Legionellas when it first came out about 10 years ago, and the guy on the course was telling me, he said, look, Daryl, the hotter the water, the better from a Legionella's perspective. But then I'm saying, well, actually, that can scald the tenant. Well, actually, that's different. That's a different set of rules. So, in terms of the hot water, it should be as hot as it possibly can. But from another perspective, when you talk about health and safety, they go, actually, it can't be too hot because it will scald the tenant. But from a Legionella's perspective, it's as hot as it possibly can, so it can kill off any bacteria in the water system, obviously. Again, the majority of the properties, I would say, probably fall into this category, the low risk, small, 3-bedroom house. There's someone in there all the time. There is no water tank. It's a combination boiler, and it's a very simple house, which I'm sure most of you will, 2-bedroom flat, brand new build, nice and simple, 3-bedroom townhouse, nice and simple. When you start getting into the 6 or 8 bedrooms with different systems or header tanks and all that type of stuff, if I'm being honest, that's probably a little bit high risk. So do I want to get a professional company in, maybe not to test the water, but to have, because they've got much more knowledge of those types of systems, the risk involved with that type of property, then again, that might be more suitable for you as a landlord or letting agent. But I would probably say 98% of the properties that you probably own or manage would fall under this description. So a very simple risk assessment is all that is needed. And then you've got to look again at the tenant and occupiers. If I've got 5 fit, healthy young students, then the risk to them is going to be very, very minimal. So often if I've got 2 elderly people over their 80s, like my dad, who has kidney issues and diabetes, then he's going to be higher risk. So I might need to take more into account when I'm doing my risk assessment, but also when I'm doing my control measures. Okay, how can I reduce the risk to my dad, who's over 80 and has higher risk? Okay, so I need to be maybe looking at the water system in a lot more detail, maybe need to be changing the shower heads on a more frequent basis, whatever it's going to be. Yeah, basically, Douglas, in theory, yeah, if you've got a caravan, although I'm just trying to think where the storage of water is in the caravan. Apologies, I've never used a caravan, so I'm a little bit on the lay side on that sense. But yeah, if your caravan contains water, which I'm assuming it does in terms of what do they call it, the containers for cold and hot water, I assume, then yeah, you would need to do a risk assessment. It wouldn't be very big, obviously, because there's only one room, so to speak, but you would certainly need to take it into account. And obviously the summer months, I don't know if anyone has a summer holiday home. Hopefully next year we all can go on a holiday, but in terms of like Spain, etc., if you've got a holiday home in Spain and it's been sat empty over the whole of the winter in Spain, it might be sat empty for 2 years now potentially, and then you go to your summer holiday home in, say, May, when everyone's been, after all the vaccinations have happened, and you turn on the hot or cold water, that water might have been sat there for the last 2 years with no one using it. So in that sense, you've got to be careful of that, because obviously the hotter the countries, the more chance you have of contracting Legionellas. I think Spain, obviously, Australia, New Zealand, those types of countries have much more prevalence in relation to Legionellas because of the temperature. I mean, their winter, doesn't get below, say, 10 or 15. So in that sense, you need to be wary of that. I appreciate it in terms of time, so I've got to reasonably go quickly, but in terms of the risk assessments, identify the water systems. Again, combination boiler, low risk. Storage tanks, slightly higher risk potentially, depending on how big your storage tanks is, how easy is it to access your storage tank, etc. Then you've got to check the temperatures of the outlets. So just a very simple thermometer. I think someone bought a meat thermometer, which cost about £20. You just run the water, I think they say for 2 or 3 minutes, and you just test the cold and hot water outlets. So above 50, So obviously the higher the better in terms of Legionellas, and obviously in terms of cold water it should be 20 or below, or obviously lower the better. I think I did mine the other day, it was about 7 Celsius, so this time of year. So but obviously the sort of temperature where they breed a lot quicker in terms of the bacteria, it was I think the pinch point is 38 Celsius is the absolute sort of like where they get really excited in relation to the bacteria growing, etc. So luckily we don't really get those temperatures in terms of the UK, but obviously foreign holidays, etc., especially for holiday homes, you need to be checking them. Storage tanks, again, if you've got storage tanks, hot and cold, make sure they're clean. So make sure there's a well-fitting lid. Make sure that the heating has been set correctly on them in terms of the hot water to make sure that they heat to a certain temperature. So if there was any Legionellas in the system, it kills it off. So that's really, really important as well. So storage tanks for the smaller ones, nice and simple ones, the smaller houses should be relatively straightforward. But obviously for the larger, more complex houses, then it may be well advised if you get a professional company to do that on your behalf. And again, it's all about keeping the hot water hot. So a lot of your storage tanks, or what they call them, will have maybe have a hot water jacket on it to keep it hot. Again, it's all about keeping the heat above 50 Celsius to eliminate or kill off the bacteria itself. Again, I said lower risk ones from our perspective are combination boilers, so there's no storage of hot water. If you can, because some of the newer versions, obviously the newer boilers actually say what temperature the water is heated to. I think they say ensure it heats to at least 60 Celsius. So the water is heated to at least 60 Celsius, but when it comes out of the taps, it should be at least 50 Celsius. But in terms of heating or heating hot water, it should be to at least 60. Obviously, the higher the better. But from a Legionella's perspective, that is only from a Legionella's perspective. Then you've got to take into account from other legislation, it's not so hot that it scalds the tenant when it comes out of the tap itself. Yeah, in terms of that one, yeah, a well-fitting lid, Neil, absolutely would be one of them. Also, obviously taking the temperatures of the water, making sure that actually the tank itself is clean. I've had one where they found a squirrel in the water tank, which took a lot to clean out, etc. So having a lid on the water tank is really important, actually, and making sure it's well fitting. But in the first instance, you want to open it to check to make sure there's no debris in the tank itself and take a picture. I don't know if anyone's had a professional Legionella's risk assessment done. I think I've seen a few. They're about 50 to 60 pages long. I think the first 40 pages are just what I refer to as default information, but they do take a lot of pictures. So they take pictures of the taps, the temperatures, the tanks, the lids, what's inside the tanks itself, etc. So they're really important as well. Yes, at work every 3 years. Yeah, Elaine, I don't know who you work for, but yeah, absolutely, because obviously from a work perspective, they've got to do the same in your employment. Again, shower heads, as I said, high risk. So identify the shower heads, flush them through before you let new people move in. And I would say probably clean them and then change them on a frequent basis. So I would probably change them once every year. That would be my advice, because shower heads for me are going to be the higher risk. Because as I said, someone can move into a property. I mean, I actually like a bath. I don't take showers. I take a bath because that's just me. So if I had a shower above me in my house, then that shower would probably never be used. So the next person who moved into my house, they would potentially turn on the shower, and that shower might not have been used for the last 5 years. And it could have stagnant water in the shower head, and that could contain bacteria or sufficient bacteria. As soon as they turn on the shower, they're just going to breathe in loads of infected water droplets, and they're going to be contaminated. So it's just really important to look at those things and say, okay, these are the high risk areas, and this is what I'm going to do under my control measures to reduce that risk. Again, making sure all the outlets that you've taken the temperatures of the cold and water outlets, recorded the temperatures, and made sure on a frequent-ish basis that you flush through. So you might have an outside tap that they don't use that often, or a downstairs toilet that they don't use the outlets that often. So again, it's just about making sure that people understand that they should flush through those on a regular basis. I mean, I've seen it where you've turned on the water and it's come out yellow because no one's used it for so long. Again, that's going to be higher risk. So those are the things that you need to take into account when you're undertaking the risk assessment itself. Dead legs are basically pipe work where they've been cut off for a particular reason. The washing machine is probably the most common one. So again, if you've got dead legs, cut them back. So again, they're not that high a risk if I'm being honest. But again, it's just advice that you should potentially take in relation to reducing that risk. So dead legs, where can the water stagnate? And where potentially could someone be infected? Dead legs are probably lower risk, if I'm being honest, unless anyone wants to tell me differently. That's what they are, pipe work, which basically is not connected to anything in that sense. They've been cut off for a particular reason. Then hoses outside. Again, outside is probably, again, quite high risk, especially if we have warm winters and warm summers. So hoses, a bit like our first news story. Water butts, again, my parents have water butts. I keep telling them not to use them, but they do. But again, they could be higher risk. Paddling pools, ponds, those types of scenarios. So from a Legionella risk assessment perspective, they are quite high risk. So if you can eliminate them as a landlord or a letting agent, then you would do so. And if you can't eliminate them for a particular reason, you would impose, or you would have a very simple control mechanism. How do we deal with these? Okay, the hoses we flush through on a regular basis, the same with water butts, whatever it's going to be, paddling pools and ponds, where it's all about the stagnation of the water. How can we stop that stagnation happening? And how can we clean it on a regular basis? Douglas, I'm not too sure, is that once a month in terms of flushing through? Yeah, I think Elaine says every 3 months would probably be the way I would look at it. I think once a month was probably a little bit too frequently. But yeah, every 3 months, if you've got if you've got outlets and shower heads, then yeah, flush them through on that regular basis if you can, if that's what you meant, Elaine. Avoid periods. Again, how long is a piece of string? I'm sure a dealer loves that comment. More than once a month. Yeah, I mean, again, more than 1 month. So student lets in particular would be falling into that sort of regime. Obviously, over the Christmas period, it's going to be quite cold. So you're less likely to have an issue over the Christmas period. But over the summer period, yeah, you're going to have you're going to have issues. Obviously, we had a couple of heat waves this year, so yeah, student lets are one in particular. Although then you've got to bear in mind that students are probably going to be the lower risk in relation to immune systems. So, but I would certainly say between student lets, even if it's the same set of students, it would be prudent to flush through before they return in the autumn months. So that, when do they leave now? Is it May, June, and they come back in September? Then I would probably flush the system through before they returned back from their summer holidays. Education, again, without just giving them a copy of a Legionella's risk assessment, of the copy of your Legionnella's risk assessment. There are lots of tenant guides out there about how they should be dealing with Legionellas. So again, put it into that pack that you give them at the very start of the tenancy. You know, the pack that's got like 5,000 documents in it. So there's going to be 5,001 now, which they never read anyway. But again, it's all about your due diligence. What did you do to minimise the risk? Here are, Mr. Tenant. Here's a copy of the risk assessment and what you should be doing on a regular basis to minimise the risk of Legionellas to yourself. And as I said, I sort of link it into COVID now because it's exactly the same. You know, it's about breathing in contaminated droplets, and that's exactly what Legionellas is. So in a way, people are much more aware now of the potential viruses that are hanging around in the environment. Assessment, again, I think I mentioned it earlier. I would say on change of risk. So I would possibly say between tenancies would be my position. Some people say every 2 years, whatever you feel comfortable with. But for me, if I was managing a property, it'd be once between lets. That's how I would do it. Between the lets, I just go around and revisit my risk assessment. And in most cases, it's going to be exactly the same. But I'm just showing my due diligence. What have I done to minimise the risk? I was going to show you a risk assessment, which I don't really have time for now, but if you want a copy of my risk assessment, I will send it to you. I think some of you, a dealer for MPO members, you have a copy of the risk assessment.
Yeah, Daryl, I've got it. So if any MPO members want it, I can email it across to you.
I'm just going to close down my presentation, and then it should pop up. I don't know if that pops up, does it? So mine is, I know you probably can't read it, so apologies, but it's how many pages long is it? 7. I say simple and it's 7 pages, but the first couple of pages are just information. So I know you can't read it, but just to give you an idea, he just talks about the risk assessment process, what you should do, educating tenants. So that's the first couple of pages, and then 5 pages worth of just information. But actually, it's pretty simple. The address of the property, what day you're doing it, who's carrying it out. Describe the property very quickly, and then you go through the water outlets, and then you just record the temperatures. And that is so what outlets, what the temperatures are. If you've got a cold water tank, which obviously if you won't have if you have a combination boiler, then it talks about hot water, about the temperatures of the boiler, what it's heating it to. Little used outlets, utility room, garage, whatever it's going to be. Test them. Shower heads, which is saying for me is the high risk. What have you done in terms of the shower heads? Dead legs and redundant pipe work. What have you done with those? Obviously, if you dealt with them initially at the first risk assessment, then subsequent risk assessments will be nice and simple. And then 7, unoccupied properties. How long has this property been unoccupied? What have I done in relation to the risk assessment there? And then advice to tenants. Have I given the leaflets to the tenants in regards to education? And then my last page is an assessment review. So again, if I'm doing it every time that the property is being relet, then I fill one of these out. Has the risk assessment changed from when I first done it? No, it hasn't. Okay, nice and simple. I don't need to do anything else. So has it changed, or why has it changed? Then you may need to revisit certain areas again. So it's a 7-page document. For me, it's sufficient to complete your obligations as a landlord or a letting agent in relation to Legionellas for the majority of the properties that you manage or own. I said for the odd one, it won't be sufficient, and that's where you get someone to help you. But that's going to be the very, very extreme ones. I would probably say less than 1% of your properties would probably fall under that description. But if you want a copy, ask a dealer for it for MPO members. And if you're a DWK subscriber, then I'll send you my version. Just email me directly, which you should have an email for. And you'll be glad to hear, a dealer, that's me finished. A little bit like Liverpool, finished.
Does anybody have any other questions for Daryl?
I know it's Friday afternoon, they're all desperate to go back Black Friday shopping. So yeah. Is that it? Well, no, I got away with that one. I think that was reasonably comprehensive for 45 minutes of deal. I think I gave them everything they need to on that one. I think.
Thank you. Can I just say for the MPO members, if anybody wants us to do a webinar on any topic, please, if you can just email me and let me know, then I can run it past Daryl, then we can set one up. And again, if there's any particular day you'd like us to do it, if Friday doesn't suit you, just let us know and then we'll see what we can do.
Gaynor, I know you're one of my clients. Katie, are you my client or are you MPOs? Sorry. Okay, sorry, Katie. I've got a few Katies. Is that Katie Marie? It might not be. Yes. Okay, I'll send you a copy, Katie. Katie's mine. Elaine, are you mine?
Elaine might be one of ours.
Oh, is she? Apologies. They just people said please send me one. I'm thinking I'm not too sure who you are. Not disrespectfully. I'm just trying to think who Elaine. Ollie, you're definitely one of ours. No, Elaine. Okay, fine. Yeah, you've got for those at DWK. Obviously, just send me an email. And I'll send you a copy of my version of the risk assessment, and then a dealer can send her clients the version that she's got with her. Failing that, that's it now. 10 to 2. I've done the recording, so I'll send that to you, a dealer.
Thank you.
Otherwise, have a fantastic rest of Black Friday, and I don't think do we have another webinar before the end of the year?